everyone, and welcome to the Western Spirit. Today, we have a very, very special and important guest. So today, we have Admiral Mike Rogers. Admiral Rogers served as the Director of National Security of the National Security Agency and the Commander of the U.S. Cyber Command from 2014 to 2018. And that means, for those who are calculating, so he was both under President Barack Obama and President Trump, and we were joking before how much they're so similar.
Two very similar individuals.
Very similar with very similar characters, and so that's number one. And number two, Mike is and I want to get this right. You are today a partner at
I'm an operating partner
at Team 8, and Team 8 is a global venture platform that builds and invests in companies at the forefront of cyber, data, and AI innovation. And I think it's, if I'm not mistaken, Team 8 is Israeli founders.
It is.
So we have, so that's why you're here, basically. You're helping out.
I come to you.
Yes, and you are in Israel right now, I assume, to help look at companies that they're investing in.
As part of my work with Team 8, I am regularly here in Israel, generally 3 or 4 times a year, plus the work we do in the United States. So.
Wow. So how much, so let's talk first about being here in Israel since October 7th, and how were you here before, and how has the country changed after, in just from an outsider's perspective? So you're walking around Tel Aviv, you're meeting people. What is the mood now in Israel from someone outside?
So first, interestingly, I have been coming to Israel since July 1980. So I'm here for 45 years. So I'm in and out all the time. And I've been in Israel probably 5-6 times since October the 7th. This is my second. We're in March of 2025. This is my second visit this year. I was just here 2 months ago. So, and I have a lot of Israeli friends, and we do a lot of interact with a lot of the Israeli tech sector. So I get the chance to talk to people. And one thing that I've noticed this time compared to even January, but if I go back to the October 7th, a sense a little bit of, frustration / resigning. Hey, look, we're 500. I think today we're going to mark 530 days. In 530 days, what has changed? Mm-hmm. How have we, we haven't released our hostages yet. We haven't gained the release of all of them. We have not stopped the fighting in Gaza. So I think my sense is some measure of frustration with, hey, when does this end? How does this end? Lots of uncertainty. I mean, it's a tough time. Yes. And it's not unique. One of the things I was just talking to a group yesterday was this feeling of uncertainty, this feeling of, there just seems to be a lot of change and you can't figure out exactly what's going on. I bounce all over the world, from China to the Middle East to Europe to Australia to Japan, across the United States. This feeling of uncertainty, this feeling of anxiety, I see it everywhere.
In the same type of that's here after the war and everything? In
the sense, now, I'm not trying to compare the scenario.
That's very
of
optimistic
war
for Israelis, that even after war, they're the same in China or wherever.
But this sense of uncertainty, now it's different. It's uncertainty here caused by a physical conflict and a terrible act. The uncertainty is a little different in it's caused by other things. But I'm struck by, you just get this sense of anxiety. You get this sense of uncertainty. You get this sense of what is going on. So much change, things so different. How do they end? What is the new normal? How do we get to stability? It doesn't matter if I'm in Germany, if I'm here, if I'm in China's a little different, but it is amazing how much change and uncertainty is ongoing.
And that has political consequences on the world stage also, in terms of global, even intelligence-wise, and how we read other societies. They are changing so rapidly. So, for example, you're the equivalent of 8,200 in Israel. Yeah. So America, it's way bigger in America, obviously. But so you're looking, for example, one of the things we were talking about, that a lot of the intelligence is taken from open sources, right? Newspapers, social media, these things, and things are changing so rapidly. It's very hard to discern what's really happening.
Right. That combined with all the disinformation and misinformation that's out there, increasingly you're going. So what is true?
Exactly.
What is fact?
Even for intelligence officers.
Right. You're constantly trying to assess, okay, I got multiple sources of information that I'm reviewing. What's true? What's not true? What should I give more weight to or more credibility versus, well, that might be a thought, but how broadly accepted is it? How broadly adopted is it? Hey, maybe I should ignore that. It's pretty minor. It's pretty small. That's always the hard part about intelligence. You're trying to figure out what's the most relevant information, what gives you the greatest amount of insight to help you understand the situation you're trying to look at, the situation you're trying to assess. You always got to be worried about overconfidence. Look, while I may have good knowledge, it probably isn't. The thing I used to tell, I was in the intelligence business in the United States for 32 years. And what I used to always tell the teams I was a part of, never believe you have perfect knowledge. You should never believe. Now, you might have high confidence, but that's not the same thing as believing you have perfect knowledge.
Can I ask you one thing? I'm
Sure.
thinking about it so one of the things that we know now after October 7th of the intelligence failures, we were talking about it before the recording, but one thing that we do know is that there was different pieces of the puzzle, but no one connected all the pieces. And we know, for example, that there was low-level career intelligence officers that tried bringing up the chain of command different pieces. For example, Hamas fighters shooting rockets into the sea and trying them out.
Training, simulation,
taking over kibbutzim, building mock kibbutzim and attacking them in training and all these kind of stuff. And she, for example, one person that was in the news, we don't know her name, we know the story, she said to her officer, something is happening, I have a feeling this is how I read the situation, and they told her to be quiet. And so I want to ask, in America, when someone, a low-level officer, would say, look at this. This is different from the way you guys are all reading the situation. Something dangerous is happening. Is there a procedure where these low-level people could bring their stuff up, even though their commanders maybe don't, you know what I mean? Like, because sometimes you have groupthink and someone from outside the box.
There's always processes to bypass the chain of command.
Does it work?
Well, there's structured processes, and then there's just informal practices where a really motivated analyst says, look, I feel so strongly about this that I don't believe that I'm being heard. I don't believe that I'm being listened to. Look, in the end, there's always a wide range of opinions when it comes to intelligence. And as an intelligence professional, one of the things I always told people is, look, if you can't live in a world in which others have a different opinion, you're going to have a problem. So the answer I would always say is, if you're dealing with your bosses and they either don't believe you have a different opinion, the thing I used to do when my bosses would sometimes say to me, hey, Lieutenant, hey, Captain, hey, Admiral, that's not the way I see it. I would always then say to them, okay, so what would it take to change your mind? If you look at what I presented to you, if you don't agree, what is it that leads you to reject it, that leads you to say, well, I don't see it that way. Help me understand what would increase your confidence. And then I would go back to the team and say, okay,
let's do this.
Here's what we need to do. This is what they're telling me would increase their confidence. So let's figure out how to increase that confidence. Let's see what we can do to get them to change their mind. So I always tried to urge intelligence professionals, always try to get, when your bosses say they don't agree, always try to get to okay, why? Could you just walk me through why you don't agree? What leads you to reject what I'm telling you? Because I always used to argue, look, that is the nature of intelligence. You're going to deal with bosses both internally within intelligence as well as the political and the broader operational commanders, intelligence supports. You're going to run into individuals who are going to sit there and say, hey, thanks, but I don't agree, don't see it. I've had that with presidents who have said to me, Mike, that's not the way I see it. Mike, I don't agree. And like I said, I always said, okay, well, let's figure out why, and then let's see how we potentially change that.
Okay, so now I want to get to the actual what's happening on the ground. So you said we don't know what's going to happen. There's a sense of fatigue in Israel. You feel it.
Right. It seemed my sense as an outsider, and I am an outsider.
No, I agree. It depends also where you are in Israel. If you're in, let's say, Tel Aviv, I assume it's a lot more palpable than, let's say, in the settlements. People are more...
that would be my sense.
So it depends where you are, but I do think that there is generally a sense of, like, people want to know, will this end? When will it end? What is the game plan? Yeah. And I think the government needs to try to, at least try to explain what they can. Obviously intelligence, you don't want to give everything up. But yeah, so the ceasefire collapsed 2 days ago in Israel. I'm not even sure it collapsed. I think yesterday we had leaks, and maybe you can tell what you think, that the reason why Israel's attacking is to bring Hamas back to the table. So the point is, Israel says we can't do phase 2 under the terms that you want because we're not willing to finish the war, at least formally. And so you don't agree. We're now going to bomb you until you agree. Is that how you read what's happening? Because they're not going full in right now. Invasion.
Right. So first of all, we're going to need time to see how this plays out.
Yes.
A couple of things strike me. Number one, while Israel's engagement in Gaza in the last 48 hours was a significant increase over what it has been in the last several months while this phase 1 agreement was in place, it doesn't represent the full spectrum of capability that Israel could be providing. You're not seeing visible ground incursions right now. You're not seeing sustained, repeated hour after hour, airstrikes. You're not seeing artillery and mortar fire going in. So it's hard to figure out. So is this a tactic designed to change Hamas's behavior, or is this the beginning of a sustained, increased military engagement in Gaza? Based on what I've seen right now, my sense would be I don't necessarily think we're seeing right now the beginning of a sustained military engagement. It seems more like, to me, this is trying to convince Hamas,
come back.
If you don't come back, we'll keep upping the military pressure, and that's not what you want.
Yes. And so, and also, how much do you think the change of administration and I'm not talking politically, but the change of tone, there's no question about it that President Trump, even before he became president this time, put out the famous tweet with the gates of hell, I forgot. President Trump has a very unique way of saying things, but especially when he's writing them. And he said, even before he was president, like 2 weeks before the inauguration, he puts out this truth on Truth Social, and he says, that's it. Start talking, come today. And things started moving at that point on the negotiating side, both from Israel and from Hamas. They both started, giving into things they didn't give in before. And now it seems back to no one wants to get to phase 2 or agree to the other side's terms on phase 2. And Trump is giving Israel the White House put out a press release yesterday saying we support Israel 100%. And they given the weapons that Biden didn't provide. So how much does that play into the psyche of intelligence-wise, if you think of organizations similar to Hamas, how do they think when they see the country as backing by the U.S.?
I mean, I think clearly it's a factor. I'm not going to say it's an overwhelming factor in Hamas's decision calculus that it leads them to say, oh my God, the Americans are fully behind the Israelis, weapons, political support, money, etc. It'll be interesting to see, as you said several months ago, it looked like that pressure had some impact. Hey, look, let's get to some sort of ceasefire arrangement, which would allow aid to flow back into Gaza at the same time. Hey, let's work out a mechanism to release hostages.
Yes.
That played out over the course, the last 6 weeks of the phase 1 agreement. The issue to me is, so what changes this current dynamic? What gets us to an end state? Because the way it is right now, it looks like we're signing up to perpetual conflict. It's just never ending in the sense of Hamas's position is, it seems like to me, no more hostage releases until you come to an agreement about how this conflict ends and how you're leaving Gaza.
And we stay in power.
Right. And I think the Israeli government's position is, no, that's not the way we see this situation. Right. We want the hostages released, Hamas removed from political power. So you're not going to continue as you were before the conflict, before the atrocious acts you committed against us on the 7th of October. And I think the other issue you hear from the Israeli government is, and it's not over, we're not going to allow it to end until we feel we have militarily so incapacitated Hamas that you are no longer the military threat that we saw play out on the 7th of October. So there's multiple conditions here that impact this thing. Right now, both sides in many ways are just talking past each other.
Yes. And also, so President Trump, another thing that's interesting about it is that I remember at the beginning of the war, there was a lot of people were obviously in shock after October 7th, and people were very angry, and they said a lot of things that were considered before that to be very radical. As people suddenly said, we need. I remember they went to one of the kibbutzim, and one of the people, very interesting guy, Avida, I forgot his last name, who lost his son and his wife in the safe room. They were shot through the holes, and they bled out in front of him and his daughter, and he lost both his legs. And he was being interviewed. Is amazing guy, and he said, and he's a peacenik from the kibbutzim. They would bring in. He had people from Gaza working with them in the fields and in the
right.
Yeah, and he said, I've come to the conclusion we need to kick them all out. And it's like this guy who was, a lefty in the good sense of the word, and he's now there. And then things calmed down, and they even asked Netanyahu at some point, are you for transferring all the hours? No. We just need to kick out Hamas, not all the. And then he goes to meet President Trump. And President Trump says something that until President Trump said it, only people like Ben Gvir in Israel would say it. The most radical right-wing people.
People on the fringe.
And now in the polls, it's like 80-20 of Jewish Israelis that support it. And so first of all, the dynamic of when someone from outside says something changes everything. But practically, do you think there is any way to take out of Gaza a significant number of Gazans? Because we know in the polls that a lot of them do want to leave, but no one wants them and they have no way to get there.
Yeah, I mean, the first question to me becomes, okay, if the objective is to remove a significant portion of the population, where are they going?
Yes. Who wants them?
Who is going to, because they have to go somewhere else. Yes. So some other sovereign nation would have to say, yes.
Give us hundreds of thousands of people.
And look, in this neighborhood, we have watched before where large numbers of individuals have been displaced into other nations, and that has not always turned out well.
It's an understatement.
So there's a reticence, it seems to, about, wait a second, now we're not so sure about this. But in order to make that scenario work, this idea that, well, we would pull a significant portion of people out of Gaza, okay, where?
Yes.
Who? What are the mechanisms to create shelter, food, jobs?
Who's paying for
security?
everything?
That all costs money. That all takes a plan. It's not as simple as, well, we're just going to move them somewhere. No, it doesn't really work that way. Those are the issues that I'm not hearing much about.
Well, we know, I think it was the Washington Post that said that U.S. and Israel approached 3 different countries in Africa to start the process of seeing whether they wanted. So Somalia, Sudan, and Somaliland. And 2 of them went and said to them, we said no. The other one, which is Somaliland, refused to answer. And the reason, I think, is that they're being offered a lot of money by the U.S. and Israel to take them, and maybe also some of the Gulf states and everything. And then there would be, I assume, building infrastructure for these poor countries. So there is a sort of maybe way you could buy them off.
Well, remember, and the other dimension in this is, while people may say, look, I'm in a terrible situation here in Gaza. I would like to get out of it. I'd like to go somewhere else. If you said to them, so would you like to go somewhere else 1,000 miles away where you have no family, you have no connections, it's a different culture, it's a different climate, it's a different environment. Where
we'll see
where they go, I think, is an important part of the calculus of many of the individuals who potentially could be shifted in all this. This is just so complicated.
But I think the fact that it's being talked about in a legitimate way is in and of itself something interesting to
well, certainly different than you would have anticipated.
Yes.
18
could
months
you imagine
ago,
Joe Biden
October 7th?
Yeah, but even after October 7th, the whole focus of the American rhetoric was, even if we did help Israel, it was always, there's a problem, there's not enough aid, please don't go into Rafah, don't go into this, don't go into there, don't do this, Israel's doing this. We told the Israelis not to do this. Now Netanyahu, the prime minister, goes to Washington, and even if the plan might not be feasible, like we say, and we tend to agree on that, the fact that the onus is now on the other side, meaning America now, I don't know what's happening behind the scenes, but at least outwardly, the perception is that America is behind Israel.
No, you definitely get a different sense. I'm not going to argue right or wrong, good or bad, but there's a definite different sense between the messages that were coming out to Israel out of America from the Biden administration and the Trump administration. It is fair to say they are not.
And that's not a political statement.
Right, they don't fundamentally have the same approach in some ways.
So now I want to ask you something that I think is right up your alley. So what happened was October 7th happened, and Herzi Halevi, which is he's now resigned as the head of the IDF, he said not too long ago was leaked of him saying that if on the day of October 7th Hezbollah would have gone into the north of Israel, we would be in a scenario where the entire north, all the way to Haifa, would fall to Hezbollah. He said it was almost a miracle that they didn't use the opportunity to do what they wanted to do. Hezbollah thought they could do this at some point, and they didn't join Hamas. And we were lucky, miraculously maybe, that they didn't. And so that was one of the lowest days of Israel on the geopolitical stage. People suddenly saw that a relatively weak terrorist organization was able to pour in and kill 1,200 Israelis, kidnap, pillage, destroy, and actually conquer for a number of hours large parts of Israel, which is like you said, where was the army? Where were the airplanes in the air? And so since October 7th, we've basically decimated the entire Hezbollah top people.
Right in the north.
Yeah. The Assad regime fell, so the Iranian, continuance all the way to Lebanon has fallen.
The land bridge we often refer to. Yeah.
The Hamas, whether we don't know what's going to happen in Gaza final stage, but they're not the same Hamas. The Houthis, I didn't even know that we had a problem with Israel with the Houthis, but they are being now bombed by the U.S. So I assume they'll be significantly weakened. And Iran, who was this big demon. They attacked us twice. I was here for both times. It was interesting. There was loud booming noises above us, but I think only one person died, and it was a Palestinian by some shrapnel from the anti-missile defenses, but not, and then Israel attacked and supposedly took out their entire anti-aircraft.
Much of particularly the high end.
Yes. So Israel, from being in this weak position, now has basically totally, decimated, or not decimated, but really weakened its enemies. Can you talk about the way things totally changed of how Israel is perceived by its neighbors even?
So clearly the security dynamic in the region is fundamentally different in some ways than it was 18 months ago almost. I think people are surprised in some ways by, fragile is probably too strong a word, but the success that Israel has had in destroying much of the military capacity of the Iranians' key surrogate groups. Yeah. Whether that be Hezbollah, whether that be Hamas, whether that be Houthis, a little different. But, I think broadly, if you're looking at Iran now, you're going, your surrogate strategy doesn't seem to have been very effective. They've all largely, not totally, but they've all been largely weakened from what they were. Your own ability to defend yourself in terms of your ability to stop Israel, for example, from conducting strikes deep into the heart of your nation has been shown to not have worked. Your attempts to apply missiles and firepower directly against Israel itself twice have failed. So, Iran,
what's next?
What's your strategy?
Yeah.
Everything that you've done so far has largely failed. Are you going to double down on this existing strategy and say, well, we just need to get them more weapons, better weapons. We need to let them be more aggressive. Or are you going to say to yourself, perhaps the nuclear weapon is the equalizer. Hey, that's what I need to really get into. Or what you hope is, so your previous strategy failed miserably. What it shows you is perhaps, you would hope, Iran's response would be, well, perhaps I need to reach some sort of accommodation with these other nations. Now, so far they've rejected that. Just last week, the
president,
supreme leader and the foreign minister in responding to a letter from the president of the United States in which our president indicated, look, we want to enter into a series of negotiations with you to address your nuclear weapons development. And what we want is an outcome in which you formally, in the form of some agreement, you formally acknowledge that you will walk away from a nuclear weapon. You will not develop a nuclear weapon. And some sort of verification regime as well, likely.
Yeah.
And the Iranians seem to have rejected that. So the question to me then gets to be, So what's the long-term end? If they're unwilling to change, do you accept that? Or do you say to yourself, do we need to apply more pressure? Now, at the moment, the United States' pressure is in the form of what we're calling the maximum pressure campaign.
Sanctions.
This idea that through the use of sanctions, we will significantly limit their ability to sell oil and natural gas, and the amount of revenue that the state therefore no longer has access to will drive them to change their behavior. The challenge, I think, becomes that strategy of sanctions, history would suggest, takes years to have an impact, if it does have an impact. On the other hand, if you read the IAEA's latest, February 28th, so literally less than 3 weeks ago, if you read their latest verification report, it is chilling in terms of their assessment of where Iran is in its potential nuclear weapons development. They talk about sustained focus on enriching uranium. They talk about having sufficient weapons-grade uranium right now to build a weapon in an incredibly short time, like in less than a month. They talk about the fact that, hey, look, with the current trends, they could produce enough weapons-grade uranium to have a number of weapons within 4 months. So that the compression timelines have gotten really tight. So you got this mismatch. The Americans right now seem to have adopted a strategy that's going to take months and years to have an impact. The Iranians seem to have shown we've compressed our timelines down to weeks and months. So to me, there's a mismatch. So what you are hearing, based on media reporting, is the Israeli government arguing or asserting to the United States, we have to deal with this mismatch. If they won't negotiate, if they are physically telling us that they're unwilling to negotiate, given the progress that they are showing is verified by these independent entities, our only option then becomes we should strike them. We should physically destroy much of this nuclear infrastructure. That's the argument that the United States is hearing.
But I guess there's two answers to questions to that. Number one, is Israel, do you think, according to what we know, or are we, I don't know what we're allowed to say, does Israel have the capabilities to take out or significantly hurt or push back by itself the capabilities to do that to the Iranian nuclear facilities?
So I'll leave Israel to make that assessment. I would only tell you as an American military individual, our assessment was broadly to execute a strike strategy against this infrastructure. The fact that it is broadly geographically dispersed, it's not just
and way underground.
Right. It's not just in one or two places. It's in multiple locations separated by big, big distances. Much of it is deeply hardened, deeply buried underground. That the only way, if you're going to go the military option, and there are some other things you could do, but if you're going to go the military strike option, you need really massive weapons, and you need a lot of them. So think about weapon systems like the B-1, the B-52, the B-2 that in our inventory carry massive numbers of munitions. Our military in some ways is built for this kind of scenario, if you will. I'm not saying Israel can't do it, but I would say that's not the scenario that Israel built most of its military capability.
So you're saying it will be unbelievably difficult for the Israelis.
I wouldn't say unbelievable, but my comment would be this would be a real challenge to do alone.
And for America, it would be it's the type of thing that America can do.
It would be a challenge, but it would be a mission I think we could do. Now, there was always one other question. How confident are you that we have a full understanding of the total breadth of the program?
Intelligence-wise.
Right. Because if you make this decision to strike them, you want to hit everything.
Exactly.
You don't want to hit a little part of it. You want to hit everything. So one of the questions, we would have this discussion in my previous life as the leader of the largest intelligence organization in the structure. And as a military guy, we would have these discussions about, political leaders would say to us, intelligence professionals, do we truly understand the full breadth of the program? Do we know every location? Do we know every capability? Are we confident that we've got a deep enough understanding that we fully understand the targets we'd have to hit? Or is it some scenario where we hit the targets we know about and then suddenly we find out, well, they have this covert hidden facility that nobody knew about. And oh, by the way, it's got weapons, centrifuges, et cetera. That's one of those questions. And again, as we had been talking previously, one of the things I always try to remember as an intelligence professional, many times you'd have very high confidence, but having high confidence is not the same thing as absolute certainty.
Yes.
And you have to acknowledge as an intelligence professional, the times that you have absolute certainty are not always super high. Many times you're going, yeah, I have high confidence, but I don't have absolute certainty.
Yes. I want to now turn to the U.S. itself. So I grew up in New York, and on a 9/11, I was in, this will maybe show how young I am or how old, whatever. I was in the 9th grade in high school. I grew up in an ultra-Orthodox Jewish place. So, I didn't study any secular studies. So it's a long story. My point is that we were in Brooklyn, and it was a very sunny day. And we actually, from the window of our school, saw the Twin Towers on fire. And the teacher came in, and Jews, the religious Jews, ultra-Orthodox, really are, you have to study Torah all the time. And he said, we can't watch this. We have to study Torah. So he closed the shades. And after, in the recess, when we opened it, the Twin Towers weren't there anymore.
Wow.
And it was very traumatic. And then we went home early, and papers from the towers flew to Brooklyn. So it was, and from that point on, America was at war, the war on terror, Iraq, Afghanistan, Iraq, other places all over the world, but those are the two main ones. And the way Americans looked at intervention changed over the years. So I think it's safe to say that now the Iraq war in American discourse is a very negative way.
Right, it's viewed differently than it was at the time.
In 2003. Yes. And even Afghanistan, and it was like everybody agreed. Even Trump was the one that started the negotiation to leave Afghanistan. He now says, he would have done it differently, but he would have done it. My point is that the way people look at American intervention is very different in the past. It's changed so radically. And so is there a danger, and I think there is a danger, but what do you think about the danger of total isolationism just becoming the mainstream in American politics?
I don't see America going towards total isolation. I don't see an administration that's arguing America should not be involved. That's not what I hear out of Washington. Mm-hmm. This idea that America should not be involved in the broader world around it. That's not what I hear. What I hear coming out of Washington in terms of the administration, as a citizen, what I hear is America should have a different role in the world. The rest of the world needs to stand up and assume a greater responsibility, a greater role, be willing to spend more money to execute that role, should be willing to stand on its own 2 feet, should not automatically look to America as the default, well, you're going to come in and address this, you're going to make this problem go away. Those are the messages that I hear, which is a little different, which is not the same thing as, well, America wants to be an isolationist. Yes. I don't hear that. But one of the things, and I think you're seeing this a little bit in Israel. You certainly saw this in America over time in the post 9/11. I think history shows it is challenging for democracies to sustain conflicts for year after year after year. It's just not the nature of democratic societies. It doesn't mean that democratic societies don't believe in defending themselves. It doesn't mean that democratic societies don't believe that you should respond when you are wronged. You should respond to it. But what it does mean to me is most democratic societies' view is if we're going to respond, it can't be something that never ends. It can't be an eternal kind of conflict. Now, I say eternal. Look, we were in Afghanistan for over 20 years. The longest, Afghanistan represents the longest conflict for us. History? In our history, probably. Iraq, slightly less, but still, if you look at our history, it's just not the norm in America to have military conflict for decades on end. And I think it's an interesting political challenge then. And I think you're seeing it a little bit in Israel is, okay, if you believe that sustained conflict is the right way to address a particular situation, if you're a political leader, how do you sustain the political will? How do you sustain the support of your society to do that? In America, you saw how that support eroded over time, where people said to themselves, I understand why we went in. In hindsight, as you have highlighted, Iraq is viewed very differently than it was perhaps at the time. But increasingly over time, you saw more and more of our citizens going, when does this end?
What are we doing there now?
How does this end?
Yeah.
I hear the same questions in Israel. When does this end? How does this end? What is the vision for the future other than eternal conflict? I don't think most democratic societies, most citizens are going, I don't want eternal conflict. That's not my vision. So now, we're watching political leaders here and elsewhere trying to figure out, okay, so what is the strategy? What is the plan? How do you end this?
I have a proposal on just maybe a way to phrase it differently.
Sure.
That if you go to the West Bank in Israel, or even let's put the West Bank, there's here and there terrorists, doing stuff, but it's not Gaza. And there are soldiers there, and it is, maybe you can call it's an occupation in the sense that the army is controlling things and everything, but it's not the same questions like in Gaza, right? And the same thing in America, you have bases in Europe, and it's not the same, obviously, but you'll have the army is spread. You have in South Korea, between North and South Korea army, and in all these places, and no one is, at least no one in the mainstream is saying, take all the army people out. When it does come is the number of casualties. I think that is the main thing, where they're tired of people dying for a reason that they can't discern. Meaning there could be soldiers in Gaza, but if no one would be dying, no one would say anything. The only reason why people, and maybe you don't agree with me, but I think that is the main thing, the number of casualties and the toll it has on a society.
I don't think it's quite as simple as that. And I mean no disrespect by saying that, but it's more than just casualty, at least for America. Now, we're a nation of 335 million people, as opposed to Israel, which is a nation of just over 9 million. So there are differences. The casualty levels that we sustain in Iraq and Afghanistan, while clearly they impacted American public opinion, I don't think the casualty rates became the primary driver in terms of our society's views of, hey, we should end these conflicts. If you want an order of magnitude, if you look at what the Russians have lost in Ukraine,
the Russians are good at losing a lot of soldiers.
In the first 90 days, the Russians managed to lose more than America lost in Iraq and Afghanistan over 20 years of conflict.
Wow.
I mean, the Russian casualty levels in Ukraine are just massive compared to what you've seen in some other recent wars. I also think Gaza and the West Bank are a little different in the sense that in the West Bank, over time, Israel and the Palestinian Authority have negotiated access. They have negotiated a set of procedures. Gaza was a different scenario. Gaza was, hey, Israel made the decision, we're leaving. We're going to pull the settlements out. We're going to pull the military out. We're going to pull out any semblance of political or security control. Palestinians, this is yours. You're going to hold an election. You're going to decide what the right process is, but you're going to have responsibility for this. So they're not exactly apples and oranges to me. They're two very different approaches in some ways.
Do you think it was a mistake that the U.S. Basically forced Israel at the time, Condoleezza Rice, to have the elections, which Hamas ended up winning? Sharon in the beginning told her, we don't want to do it because our intelligence says that Hamas will probably win. And the Americans said, no, you need democracy. Hamas needs to be part of it. And basically that was why the elections went forward. And Hamas did end up winning.
Look, the way I would phrase it is if people knew then that the outcome was going to generate this.
It's always like that.
Everybody looked back and go, well, perhaps we need to look at other alternatives here.
Yes.
But broadly, the principle of free elections has always been something foundational to the United States. I would argue as a democracy, Israel has always broadly been supportive of free elections. That's always part of the challenge. You saw that in the UK with the
Egypt.
In the political decision about, okay, we'll have a referendum on Brexit. Don't worry. It'll
be fine.
It'll turn out okay. Well, perhaps it didn't generate the political outcome that they thought, that political leadership thought it might. So this is not unique to.
But we also saw it in Egypt with the Muslim Brotherhood.
Yep.
Okay. So now I want to get to things that are outside of Israel, but also that have to do with maybe even with your profession now, in the sense that a lot of the Russians, the way that we know that they have cybersecurity capabilities of attacking the West, and they've used it in different forms over the years. The famous RussiaGate story. It doesn't even matter, how, if the story, the way it was framed, is right. But we do know that they've been trying to influence internal Western conversations in some way or another. Again, they do it on all sides. That's what's interesting, where they'll go and they'll be pro, the Democrats. And then a second later, you'll see another page that's run by them, and they're trying to push Trump people to go out and protest. They do it all because they're trying to make the Western societies a little, crazy, and it helps.
Well, they
them.
want internal conflict.
Yes.
The Russians believe that internal conflict within Western societies is in Russia's best interest. It keeps them weak. It keeps them divided. It makes them slow to respond. It makes them not focused on things Russia's doing, but rather focused on things they disagree with each other.
And it weakens them from within.
It's part of a conscious strategy on the part of the Russians.
So how much? And then I read not too long ago from a bunch of people that said that they have not used their full capabilities that America thinks they have in certain regions where, for example, on the Ukraine war and other places. And do you think that's true? Or because I read that not too long ago in the Washington Post, I think it was, that analysts say, they always have analysts say.
I'd like to meet Mr. Analyst
exactly.
one day. I'd really like to meet.
I don't know who he is. He keeps on popping
up.
up.
Meet that one guy.
But what do you think? They
Man
are
or
using?
woman. So first of all, remember, cyber exists in a broader context. So it is a reflection of, and in this case, we're talking about the Russian. So the Russian use of cyber, whether they use it or they make the decision not to use it, is reflective of a broader strategy and a broader context. I think what you're seeing out of the Russians is they've used cyber as a tool. Number one, these aren't in any priority order, but they've used cyber as a tool to sow disagreement and discord within societies. They do that through disinformation and misinformation and the use of social media and cyber-associated technologies to do that. They clearly view it as an element of espionage. Hey, let's break into classified systems in the U.S. and other governments. Let's try as well to access sensitive defense technologies, to steal it, to potentially give us, the Russians, some measure of awareness about what the West is doing, but also some potential advantage in terms of let's steal that technology. Mm-hmm. They also clearly view it as a broader tool in an ongoing war in Ukraine. There's a lot of Russian cyber activity being directed against networks, data, infrastructure within Ukraine. They have not had the level of success I think most people thought they would, in part because you're seeing the Ukrainians' ability to really generate a high level of cyber resilience. The impacts tend to be restored relatively quickly. Often they're stopped from even having impact. When they do have impact, the Ukrainians have shown this ability to recover very quickly. I think there's a lot to learn from that. I also think the Russians are a little bit concerned about, so look, we have all this cyber capability. As an example, we have a lot of capabilities that they often don't use. They don't use their nuclear et cetera. I'm not trying to compare cyber or nuclear. Just a reminder, they have a broad range of capabilities. Many of them they choose not to use. Cyber they use, but perhaps not as broadly as they might, perhaps not as aggressively, perhaps not as destructively. And I think that reflects this broader strategic idea of, look, they want to create pressure, they want to create impact, but they don't want to generate an impact that leads to a response from the West. So they do enough that the West—
just under the limit.
Right. This idea of war in the gray zone we always used to talk about. How do you use your capabilities in a way that have impact, but they don't trigger a response by the other side? The Russians are very good at this.
How in the Ukraine war, so I remember the first week or two, everybody was saying, that's it. They're going to take Kyiv in the next week or so. Russia's on its march to Kyiv. The Russian army, superpower Russia, and this little country, Ukraine, and they're on the way to Kyiv. And I remember there was reporters in Kyiv, and the place was empty. Mm. The men went, I guess, to war. Everybody else was running away, and they never got there. And they've been, Russia now is making some advances. The war for like 2 years basically is stalled. It keeps on moving back and forth, but not in a significant way. And like you said, they've lost so many soldiers. It's unbelievable. And my question is,
so much so they had to go to a third party, the North Koreans, to get more.
And the Iranians are helping them with different stuff and stuff. And so my question is, how much have they been degraded on the world stage? So a lot of world politics is perception. People think you're very strong, and then suddenly, boom, you've lost thousands upon thousands of your troops. You have to go to other dictatorships to get these. And I hear that the North Koreans are not that great fighters on the battlefield itself. So what is the perception of Russia now on the world stage?
So perception is very interesting. If I'm in the United States, when I'm in Europe, the narrative is the Russians were a total aggressor who totally violated and refused to respect the sovereignty of another nation, and who used military force in an illegal, arbitrary manner to attempt to override the valid sovereignty of an independent third nation.
Yeah.
If I'm in Asia, when I'm in Africa, I hear a very different narrative in many places. Hey, the Russians acted in a measure of self-defense because NATO and the West were slowly moving closer and closer, and were pressuring them. So I remind people the narrative on this conflict in Ukraine is not universally accepted. You get a different perception based on where you are. Now, I ascribe to that which you hear in America and Europe. This was the Russians in a blatant use of force to attempt to drive Ukraine to do things that the Ukrainians didn't want to do, like, hey, you can't tell me I can't join NATO. You can't tell me I can't join the European Union. You can't control the choices Ukraine, make as a sovereign, independent nation. We in Kyiv will make the decisions that we think are appropriate for our citizens. And we do it in a peaceful manner. We're not interested in invading Russia. We're not interested in a military conflict with Russia. We're not trying to change the political leadership in Russia. We're trying to do what's right for our citizens. I believe that. I'm firmly of that opinion that this was a totally illegal act on the part of the Russians.
But one of the things, I interviewed the Czech foreign minister 2 weeks ago, and they say that if Russia wins, we're next. All these Baltic states and the states that are former Soviet Union were pretty much all of them, maybe except for Hungary, are worried about that. And my question is, does Russia even have the capabilities at this point? They've lost so many soldiers. They've been so degraded. They need to bring in foreigners to fight their wars. Maybe we can even if the peace agreement before I ask you about that, it seems to me that maybe not, but they're so degraded. There's no way in the near future they're doing anything.
Well, I think a lot of it has to do with how long-term a view do you take?
Yes, exactly.
If you look at Russia under Putin, cyber activity against the Baltic states back in the 2007 timeframe, outright armed military invasion of Georgia, Ukraine twice. I think many European nations, particularly the further east you are in Europe, say, look at the Russians' behavior over time. Mm-hmm. They have shown a willingness to intrude on the sovereignty, whether they've done it with cyber and disinformation and misinformation, assassination, all the way to outright armed invasion. And while you could make the argument, well, perhaps this wouldn't happen in the next year or two because they've been so weakened, I think many European nations argue we have got to develop a strategy that thinks long term here.
So just two more topics on Ukraine and Russia. So, and this has to do with cybersecurity. So it also has to do with your job and maybe some of the companies that you guys are looking at. So recently, in order to pressure Zelensky basically to come back to the table after the famous blow up at the Oval Office, the U.S. Announced a pause on the offensive cyber operations that they were going to help the Ukraine supply to the Ukrainians.
We're doing against the Russians, but the announcement was against what the U.S. is doing.
And then now they gave it back to them because Zelensky agreed to the ceasefire. That's what I understand. They said the U.S. intelligence is we're going to share intelligence again. I assume that has
although if I could, we're interlacing a couple of things here. What the U.S. announced, according to media, was direction from the Department of Defense to United States Cyber Command saying, look, at the direction of the administration, we are stopping or at least temporarily holding offensive cyber operations by the United States against Russia.
Okay.
At the same time, the administration announced we're going to put a hold on weapons deliveries to Ukraine, and we're going to put a hold on the U.S. provision of intelligence to Ukraine. So 3 slightly different
So they only
things.
brought back the intelligence and the weapons, but not the cybersecurity?
Well, I'm not in the government, so I don't know.
They did say they brought back the intelligence.
Right. Now, they brought back the intelligence support, and they've talked about resuming military.
So we don't know about the cyber stuff yet.
They have not publicly commented on the cyber operations piece.
So what does that mean? What exactly does that mean? Like, what does the offensive cybersecurity do for our American allies?
Well, I mean, offensive cyber is incredibly sensitive and highly classified, so I'm not going to go into the details of it. But in general, I point out a couple things. What you've watched is the United States applying pressure to Ukraine to say, look, we, the United States, believe that the right answer is, in terms of this administration, we believe that agreeing to a unilateral ceasefire is in Ukraine's best interest, and that's what we want to see. And the Ukrainians have subsequently agreed to that, and then you saw that support turned back on.
Yes.
At the same time, the United States is trying to make an argument with the Russians. You should agree to a ceasefire, and then you should enter into a series of a negotiation process with the United States and Ukraine about how the conflict in Ukraine ends. I think this decision that's been announced about ceasing cyber activity against Russia, if you will, is part of a U.S. message sending to the Russians about, look, we want you to agree to this ceasefire. We want you to agree to a negotiation process. We're willing to back off a little bit on some of the things we have done that we know you dislike. We'll see if the strategy works.
But do we also, just in general, yesterday the president and both presidents, Putin and Trump, spoke on the phone.
Right.
And they said they agreed to a limited ceasefire. I don't know what that means. It was not explained to the public what it means. Let's say even they do agree to a ceasefire, but then someone breaks the ceasefire, or they use pretext. A lot of times the Russians will say, these people that speak Russian in this place told us they want us to come save them. And then they'll use that. So they have different ways to get around agreements. So let's say that happens. You need to have the stick, right? So you give them the carrot. We're stopping the cyber stuff. We're going to, all these kind of stuff. But I haven't heard the administration say what the stick is to the Russians. What are they going to do if Russia doesn't?
So what you've heard this administration talk about in the last week prior to the phone call was, now look, we're going to have a phone call. We're going to discuss this. And out of this phone call, we're looking for some measure of agreement towards a ceasefire.
Yes.
If you don't do that, what the administration talked about in the last week was economic sanctions.
To ramp them up.
And tariffs that, hey, we would wrap. Now, my view would be Russia's already under the most significant economic sanctions we've arguably ever applied to any nation. What leads you to believe that a new set of sanctions would have a significant impact, particularly in a short period of time? And with respect to tariffs, Russia's importing into the United States is at an all-time low since the Soviet Union fell. There's no products to impose tariffs on. Russian imports to America are almost negligible, a very small level. So I understand the sticks we have talked about publicly so far. They don't seem like very big sticks or effective sticks to me. What came out of this phone call, what you've heard so far is, well, what the Russians agreed to was a ceasefire in terms of both sides attacks against electrical infrastructure.
What about
against the power? I'm going, well, what does that have to do with battlefield fighting? What does it have to do with attacks against petroleum infrastructure? What does that have to do with? So I just find this, it makes me scratch my head a little bit about, that's not a partial ceasefire. But again, I wasn't part of this negotiation. We don't know the details. I'd like to see more details.
One of the things that we keep, there's two ways to look at it, even if you're pro-Ukraine, and this is the last I will be talking about this, and I want to get to what you're doing here in Israel specifically. But the way I would is, one, people would say Ukraine needs to get everything, all the land back, and we have to fight all the way to the end. That was the Biden approach, I think. We're support, even though they didn't allow them to use the weapons inside Russia, but whatever, at least publicly. All the way to the end. And Trump, I think, is saying more practically, you're not going to get everything. There's no way. and even said, "You're not joining NATO. You're not. It's not happening." I think Mike Waltz said a few days ago on Fox that they're not going to get Crimea or the Donbass. Probably. Be realistic, basically. You're going to get security guarantees. We're going to sign this mineral pact with you. You're going to get lots of money, but be realistic. What do you subscribe to if you look at that?
So I think that's an accurate readout of the spectrum of messages that Ukraine has gotten from the United States. So put yourself in their shoes. They're operating under one set of goals, one set of strategies. America has an election. We elect a different administration, and suddenly the messages that Kyiv gets are totally different, where they're going, wait a second, what's happened here? Also, don't forget the very human element here. If you're Ukraine, you're going, we have lost tens of thousands of our citizens. We've got hundreds of thousands who have been injured. We have millions of our citizens who have been internally displaced. We've got millions of our citizens who have left trying to get to a more secure environment. Russia has destroyed much of our economy, has destroyed much of our infrastructure. Russia now occupies something like under 20%, slightly under 20% of what had been prior to the start of this conflict, had been sovereign Ukrainian territory. If you're the Ukrainians, I think you look at this as, look, we want the conflict to end, but we also want it to end in a way that ensures our long-term security.
Yes.
And one of the questions I think that the Ukrainians keep trying to remind the Americans is the Russians have shown an unwillingness or inability to fully comply with almost any agreement they've reached. So this idea that we're going to create, if you're Kyiv, one of the things they're telling the Americans is, we understand the desire to end the conflict, but remember, you're dealing with a country that has shown a total unwillingness to abide by agreements. Hence this desire about, okay, but what about the guarantees? How do we know that this is going to be protected? The American argument, I think they're hearing from this administration, is it's in your best interest to end the conflict. Just take the emotion out of it, which is easy to say when you're sitting in Washington.
Two oceans,
right?
Big, beautiful oceans.
I'm going easy.
Like President Trump said.
Step back. In the long run, terminating the conflict is in your best interest. And we, the United States, largely, as you said, through the economic piece, face the military piece. Hey, we're not going to put U.S. forces on the ground in Ukraine, but we'll create an economic structure in which the Russians will realize you don't want to go back in again. You don't want to violate an agreement, because to do so would undermine or terminate this economic relationship, and that would be unacceptable to the United States. That's the hope here. The challenge is, to me, that's all great, but in the end, this is as much about the Russians as it is about the Ukrainians.
Ukraine, but no one's talking about the Russian part.
So to me, you either got to convince the Russians that terminating the conflict is in their best interest, and you've got to convince the Russians that not only do you want to terminate the conflict, you don't want to resume it. You don't want to try to undermine it. Whatever agreement we come up with. Like you already did. Right. You don't want to repeat your behaviors of the past. If we're going to reach agreement, you got to comply with it, and you got to stick to it. So there's a lot of unknowns here. And just as Israel is seeing in Gaza and in Lebanon, when you're trying to resolve conflicts, when you're trying to end ongoing wars, you can never forget the human dimension in all of this.
100%.
It isn't enough just for politicians to make these broad, sweeping general statements. There's a human impact. There's loss, pain, destruction, and that makes it really challenging.
So I'm going to ask you about something that's maybe a little more cheerful.
Good.
Because I was about to be sad, but actually we should be sad. A lot of people lost their lives and are still losing their lives every day. So I'm shifting to your role now. You're a partner.
Let's talk about Team 8.
Yes, you are a partner at Team 8, which I am told has, and also read about, has put billions of shekels into, and maybe dollars. You'll correct me if I'm wrong. I'm not. It's different systems, but into Israeli high-tech companies. And so I wanted to ask you first and foremost, What do you think of the Israeli high-tech industry post October 7th? So one of the things we've been talking about in Israel, of the economy after the war, a lot of people have been saying right away feeling was the high-tech industry would be, people would leave. It's very easy to leave,
right?
Because all you need is basically a computer,
and you have a job skill that is highly
everybody
sought at everywhere around the world. Everybody wants it,
and yet, surprisingly so, it seems to be the ecosystem is still working pretty much. People coming from reserves going back. It's still, I have friends who work in high tech, and in Gaza they have the satellite internet, and while they're on guard duty, they're working their stuff what they need to do and answering emails and doing all this kind of stuff. So how do you see what's happening here in terms of the economy and the places that you meet the companies?
So first of all, the tech and startup culture of Israel remains incredibly strong. And if you want the ultimate validation of that, look what's happened in the last 24 hours with Google's acquisition of Wiz for $32 billion. The rest of the world, the outside world, I'll speak for the United States, America clearly sees the tech entrepreneurship, clearly sees the innovation, clearly sees the power of Israel's culture and innovation and in creating, tech and cyber capabilities. You continue to see American money invested here. You continue to see American acquisition here. You continue to see trying to create more and more companies. That's what Teammate was built around, the idea of, is there a way to harness the power of this innovation, the power of this culture to create companies, whether it be in our enterprise area where we're focused on tech, cyber, AI, whether it be in the fintech area where we try to create companies in fintech, whether it be in the health area, and then also whether it's in the capital area where Teammate, one of our newest dimensions is this idea of, can we ourselves become not just create companies, but can we become investors to help create companies outside of Teammate? It's a pretty broad spectrum, but the whole idea is the power of innovation, doing venture a little differently. And this idea of, look, let's take advantage of the culture of innovation and just tech ability that resides in Israel. And I think the rest of the world sees that same thing and wants to be involved with it, wants to access it, wants to take advantage of what it generates. I think that has not been diminished by the war.
Not even slightly, you think?
No, and I won't say not at all, but I saw some impact initially where there was a little sense of, okay, let's step back. What does the war mean? Does it change anything? Hey, are people going to be leaving? I heard those discussions in maybe the first 3 months.
But never materialized.
But it never really materialized, and that's not what I hear, and that's not what I see now. I see a sustained commitment to, hey, we're an innovative society. The war represents a significant issue, a significant challenge for us, and we're trying to deal with that as a society. But it's not going to stop us from the kind of innovation and technical generation that has been a hallmark of Israel. And part of it just goes to the culture. It is amazing. I ran NSA, the equivalent of 8,200. When I would talk to NSA's workforce and ask them, so the majority of you may not do this for your entire careers. What are you thinking about in the future?
Yeah.
I would seldom hear, I'm going to create a company. I'm going to get out. I want to create a company. I want to do a startup. Hey, I see this problem set. I think there's a technical solution to it. I'd like to try to create that technical solution, monetize it, create a company. I seldom heard that. Every time I would come to 8,200 in Israel here, and I would say, hey, conscript force, the majority of you are not going to spend your adult lives doing this. What are you thinking about? I want to create a tech startup. I want to move. I want to create a startup in Israel, and then I want to move to the United States. I want to go to Silicon Valley or New York. Yeah. I would hear that all the time. So it's just interesting, different cultures.
How do you explain it, by the way? Does it have to do with the fact that everyone goes to the army and it became sort of like especially in places like 8,200, it's like everyone does it. and then it becomes a sort of internal culture that feeds itself.
Yeah.
People want to be innovative because everyone else wants to be, you want to be better than everyone else, and you sort of the competition between camaraderie between people at these places.
Well, I think there's a view, number one, in America, let me look at America first, which have always been a part of. What you generally get from that workforce is, number one, the majority of them actually do stay for decades. The retention is super high, and they tend to view it as a career. Now, not everyone, but a majority of them tend to view it as a career. So their view is, no, I've made my choice. This is what I want to do. I want to be in the government. I want to be in intelligence. I want to serve the nation in this way. Mm-hmm. What I hear in Israel is different. Not good or bad. It's just different.
Yeah.
Some people argue, a small percentage, yeah, this is what I want to do. I'm going to stay. But what I also hear is, look, there's lots of ways to serve the nation, and creating a strong and vibrant economy and helping to take this knowledge that I've learned in the IDF and applying it. That's what I want to do. So it's just slightly different cultures, slightly different models. But it is interesting how different the dynamics are.
Admiral, can you tell us a little bit? Could I call you Admiral?
Call me Mike, please.
Mike, could you tell us a little bit about some of the more interesting, like maybe 2-3 companies that you can tell us about that you've helped finance in Israel?
So if you take a look at, first of all, step back from the company. Let's just think. If you're concerned about cloud security, if you're concerned about browser security, the thing that I love about the Team 8 model is it starts from a premise that says, let's identify the toughest cybersecurity. Now, we as I said, we do health, we do fintech, we do capital, but I'm going to focus on what we call the enterprise piece, which is cyber, tech, AI. We start from a premise that says, let's identify the toughest problems. What is it that most entities out there are concerned about when it comes to tech, cyber, AI? So first we try to identify what are the tough problems. Then we ask ourselves, okay, we'll identify the problems we think are really worth pursuing. And then we'll ask ourselves, so how do we identify a founder? How do I identify a team that can come together and can develop a solution to that problem? And we'll create a company to do that. So we spend a lot of time trying to identify founders and help them build teams to address these technical issues. And then we say to them, okay, got great people. Now we got to develop a technical solution. And then we got to monetize that technical solution. The thing I love about Team 8 is the power of that model. It's all about hard problems that are really relevant and match them up with great people, really strong leadership, and who've got a great idea of what are the potential solutions to the problems. I love that idea. And underpin that by, as these companies are being created, as they're being formed, Team 8 is there to say, hey, look, we're here to help you. We found, create, and support a lot of companies. So let's give you the benefit of that experience as you're growing on your journey. And several of them ultimately end up being acquired or sold. I think we've sold 5 or so in the last 18 months that have been acquired. Wow. Ultimately they're acquired by something. But it's just great to see this idea of, which is what attracted me to. Number one, I'm involved in Team 8 because I believe in Israel, and I loved the technical capabilities and the entrepreneurship and the innovation that I saw when I've been coming here for 45 years, as I said, and I loved the power of innovation that I would see when I would come here. I wanted to continue to be a part of that. Secondly, I love the idea that let's go after the hard problems that really matter, where people are just crying out for solutions. I loved that. And I also love the fact that in the end, it's all about great need combined with great people.
Yes.
That was my military experience. It was all about people.
Right. And Mike, you see what's so good about being an innovator and an entrepreneur at the same time is that you see a need where people need something, and then at the end result they have what they need.
Right.
So you see in real time.
You actually make an impact.
Exactly. So you're making money, obviously, but you're also the reason why you're making money is because you're providing a service that people need.
Right. They need and they value it.
Yeah.
So that's why for me, that is the energy the idea of teammate that I just love being a part of. I love the model. I love the approach. I just thought, man, this is great. And now I watch these companies. I watch these founders. I watch the teams they create. I look at the technical solutions they generate. And I just think this is all about the power of innovation, the power of leadership, and the importance of doing something that's really relevant that people care about and they want answers to. Hey, help us. What you hear is, here's the problem. Help us. We don't have a solution.
Exactly.
Help us find a solution. I love that. That's what Teammate's all about.
And Mike, we're nearing the end, and I have to say one thing that I do find very interesting, and you've said it, so you don't even have to comment. I'll just say that it's amazing to me, just even if I was not in Israel, the fact that all this is happening while there is a war on 7 fronts. So people are in their bomb shelters, working on the computer in their safe rooms, mamad, it's in Hebrew. So you're in. What happened was in the beginning, all these sirens started coming out. They found solutions where they just moved the offices to the safe rooms. So you didn't even have to get up when there was a siren. You just continued working. And so all this is happening when there's a war and sirens are flying all over the place and missiles and the Iranians and the Hezbollah and people are still working and companies are flourishing.
It is an amazing thing to see.
Cool.
As I said, I come to Israel regularly. So I have been here a couple of times where I'll be working, we'll be in a meeting, the sirens go, okay, we need to go to the safe room.
You walk out, you walk back in.
You just go in, and even when we're in the safe room, we just keep doing the meeting. We just keep talking. We're all on our laptops. We're Zooming with America while we're in the safe room. Siren goes, okay, we can leave. We go back. Literally, this just happened to me when I was here in January. I said to the team, how do you get used to this? I said, it's just a little surreal to me. We literally just went through this for about 45 minutes, and it was as if nothing happened and nobody talked about it. It was, okay, it's over, we're back. Let's get back to work. I just said, as an American, my society would have real challenges.
Panic attacks all the time.
With this in terms of it's just not what we're used to.
Yeah.
But it shows you the power of resilience here in Israel about, look, we live in an area that is insecure. We live in an area in which there's a lot of entities that want to harm us, want to hurt us. We've got to build a life that acknowledges that. We can't stop living because of all this. And living also includes work. Now, It's only one dimension of life, but it's just amazing to watch the resilience of
But what
society.
I love about it is that the work is actually to help people have better lives
Yeah.
all over the world. And also, like, we're talking about the just basic things, like today we're talking the flash drive. Or like different stuff that we take for granted, and it's like today we can't imagine living without them and they made our lives so much easier, so much better. Technology has its own problems, but you spoke about that, the fact that everyone in the world is panicking, no one knows what's going to happen, and a lot of that is technology, but a lot of good has come from technology. So we do have to say that, and I want to say that. We ended off with Ukraine very depressing, and now I'm moved and optimistic. So, Mike Rogers, it was a pleasure talking to you. I want to say that you are also the fact that you're here in Israel, supporting us, saying even you have probably 100 different companies that would want to work with you. You're working with an Israeli company that's doing good, and you're doing good. So, thank you so much for being with us.
No, thanks for the opportunity. And look, for my Israeli friends, this is a tough situation.
Yes.
A lot of pain, a lot of emotion. Not easy if you haven't lived it and haven't experienced it. However this moves forward, I believe in the power of this nation. I believe in the ability of its citizens. And, look, Israel's got a long future ahead of it.
Thank you so much, Mike.
It won't be easy, but you'll be there.
God willing. Thank you so much, Mike. And thank you so much, guys, for being with us. If you have, my last thing to the audience is if you have any questions, comments that you respectfully, obviously, would want me to relate to Mike and he can answer or whatever you choose, send them to me. You have all my emails, socials, everything. The good stuff I'll pass on to Mike. And if he feels obliged, he'll answer. And either way, keep up the good work. Keep on watching our videos and read us in the newspaper in Hebrew. So we'll have this up on Globe's magazine. And so we'll have it. Hebrew readers will be able to read this in Hebrew, and English viewers will be able to watch and listen in English. So I have double exposure. And so thank you guys so much. It was a pleasure.